Hello and thank you very much for joining the SHAIO webinars. Today's session is going to be dedicated to the current outstanding winners of the Emilio Fontela Award, granted by the Hispanic American Input-Output Association. During the 10th SHAIO conference held in Gijón early in September, we all knew the decision of the winners of the Fontela Prize. In this edition, the number 8, the jury agreed to name Jacobo Ferrer and Sergio Álvarez, both from the Technical University of Madrid, as the winners of the Emilio Fontela Prize because of the quality of the paper proposed, which was entitled Tracking the Local Drivers and Global Suppliers of Urban Scope 3 CO2 Emissions and Application to the City of Madrid. Congratulations, Jacobo and Sergio, and thank you for accepting the invitation to the webinar, allowing the SHAIO community to learn about your paper. Jacobo will be our speaker today, so I will briefly introduce him. Jacobo Ferrer is a researcher in the Department of Land Morphology at the Technical University of Madrid, and his research is currently focused on completing his PhD in environmental and distributional applications of input-output models at the city scale. His PhD is under the supervision of Sergio Álvarez. Regarding his career, Jacobo holds an undergraduate degree in sociology and a graduate degree in economics from the Complutense University of Madrid, as well as having graduate and doctoral studies from the New School for Social Research in New York. His first contributions has been published in relevant journals such as Contributions to Political Economy and the Review of Evolutionary Political Economy. Previously, Jacobo has worked on compiling and analyzing household surveys at the United Nations Procurement Division and the European Central Bank. I think it's great news for the Spanish university system to have someone like you back home, and it is also great news to have you immersed in SHAIO. It will be a pleasure to continue learning from you in the forthcoming SHAIO events. So therefore, I can only give the floor to Jacobo to start his webinar. And as you know, you will have about 40 minutes to present your paper, and after that, we will have about 20 minutes of discussion with all attendees. So thank you, Jacobo, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, first of all, for allowing me to present this work that Sergio and myself have done. It's been a lot of work, and we are very, very happy to share it with even more people than we did during the SHAIO. The title is basically the same, and I would like to highlight kind of two things: the idea of local drivers and global suppliers, and the relation to the city scale of the city of Madrid. I think these three elements will be the pivot around which we are going to discuss the results. Okay, let me see. All right. So the basic structure will be pretty standard. First, the kind of motivations and the objectives. Then I will talk a little bit about quite a bit about the methodology and the sources, because I think the main contribution might be in processing all these to piecing together all these methodological parts that are quite complicated to put together, and so that we can actually get to results that might not be too original, but at least just emerge after a long process of working through the methodology and the data and so forth. So the main objective of this work is to compute the carbon footprint for the city of Madrid from the perspective of economic activity, GDP in this case, and consumption and the activity of households, right? From the household perspective and economic activities. This is relatively simple objective, but as we will see, is challenging from the methodological point of view. The basic motivation of the original motivation that shared with me Sergio was to try to bring some new information to the City Council of Madrid in this case, to try to provide additional information about the actual magnitude of the carbon footprint of the city, so that this can be factored into decarbonization plans that are currently designed by the city. So as a general reminder, computing carbon footprints of cities is quite important, because the weight of cities is disproportionate in terms of the global population. It is estimated that by 2050, we will see like close to 70% of the world population living within cities. And cities are special areas in the sense that they are very biased towards certain economic activities, such as services, whose direct emissions tend to be lower than manufacturing and energy production, which tend to happen outside the city. So this specificity, along with the concentration of high rents, high incomes, and so forth, make everything make cities like an important kind of locus of analysis. So also computing from the consumption-based approach, meaning that we not only care about direct, but also about indirect scope 2 and 3 is going to be, is actually very important, and we want to contribute in this area. And thanks to the emergence of global multi-regional input-output databases, basically Figaro for this paper, the geographical disaggregation on top of the industry or sectoral disaggregation is going to be fundamental to try to come to grips with the actual suppliers of these indirect emissions. I think probably most of the people here will kind of have basic knowledge about the input-output at least, so I don't want to dwell on that, but I would like to say that if we take a look to the typical definition of the consumption, the carbon footprint, I would like to highlight like the three elements that, as I said, tend to be missing from an analysis of the carbon footprint of urban areas, specifically as distinct from countries or even regions. And as we can see, this E and this Y and the capital A are the three elements that tend to be missing. The first are the emission intensities, meaning the amount of the kilograms of CO2 equivalent per unit of output at current prices, nominal output. The technical coefficient matrix, we do have it for the country. We even have it for the regions, but not for the cities. And that's a peculiarity that we need to kind of tackle. And finally, the final demand vector. It can be consumption, it can be different demand vectors as government spending and so forth. But at the city scale, it's not so easy to come up with this information about consumption expenditure by households or even GDP activity by, within the city. Just to highlight that when we talk about households, we need to take into account that the carbon footprint is not only based on their consumption expenditure, but also their direct production of emissions, meaning when you turn on your heat or your cooling, the AC is producing emissions that need to be taken into account. And basically and fundamentally, the use of your private car is producing a lot of emissions, and this needs to be factored into the total computation. Just talking about the main data sources, as I said, the idea is that we have different pieces and we try to put them all together. The first thing that is going to be the general framework is exploiting the fantastic Figaro database that was recently, it's a few years now, published, because it's providing us with a global multi-regional input-output table that is not only comprehensive in terms of the geographical coverage, which goes up to 47 countries, which is quite a lot, but also the period goes from 2010 to 2022, and this is very, very important, as we will see. Also, we have a breakdown, an industry breakdown using the NACE classification industries, which is 64, but as I will mention, this is not going to be exactly the disaggregation that we are going to use. Another element that is very important here are Eurostat's air emissions and air accounts and inventories. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between the two because it's not so straightforward. And also from kind of the Madrid side of things, we have the regional supply and use framework that is provided by the Autonomous Community of Madrid, which is going to be kind of the template to project the city table, as I will discuss. And then we are very lucky that the City Council produces in Madrid a wealth of economic and environmental information that is not typically available for most cities. And I would say this is quite extraordinary and very useful for us in terms of having GDP information at a 28 sector disaggregation, which is going to be the disaggregation that we are going to use, that we used in the paper and we will show here. But also an GHG emissions inventory, which is we are going to use to transform it into accounts. So this is kind of the main data sources. Of course, we have three main methodological challenges that I'm going to go over. And just to summarize, first of all, is not having a city scale input-output table to kind of tackle this problem, we are, as I said, we are lucky to have a regional input-output framework that we are going to use to project the city scale using the information from the city console, right? Of course, to my knowledge, almost no city have official input-output tables, but we have quite a growing literature on how to project and use these regional or national information to produce city scale tables. So as I said, we are going to use the regional supply and use framework, the local economic accounts, and our purpose is not only to come up with a table for the city that we can use using equation 1 that I provided before to try to estimate the carbon footprint, but actually to embed this table within the Figaro database, right? And this for us is very important. And this involves quite a bit of methodological assumptions and nuance, in the sense that we need to connect the import and the export side of the table from Madrid to the rest of the world. And of course, subtracting these from Spain, so we will have Spain divided between the city of Madrid, which is relatively small but important at the country level, and the rest of the country, including the rest of the Madrid region. Yeah. If anyone has any questions or wants to discuss this in more detail during the questions, I mean, we can do it, but I wouldn't dwell on this point for too long. The second challenge is, of course, the derivation of city air emissions accounts. As I said, Madrid has a very good emissions inventory, but there are certain differences between emissions inventories and accounts. Accounts are typically economic, whereas inventories are approached from a functional or engineering point of view. And to bridge these two is quite challenging, but also fundamental, because otherwise we cannot find our E to multiply the matrix and the final demand vector to come up with the final result. As I said, there are two key differences. One is the territorial versus resident principle. Inventories focus on what's happening in terms of emissions within the city boundaries, whereas from an economic point of view, you need to subtract emissions from tourists while they're in Madrid and bring into the city accounting the emissions that Madrid tourists are producing abroad, right? So, and this happens also for firms and so forth. So this requires certain assumptions using information from the Barajas airport, as we did, and certain other auxiliary information sources. And also another important issue is that as I said, the classifications in which inventories are presented or present the information and the accounts that we require to produce the carbon footprint are incompatible and need to be bridged. So we follow a fourfold process to create air emissions accounts for the city of Madrid, which we consider kind of like a contribution of the paper. The first, we, as I said, adjust the resident principle using certain assumptions. We then create a correspondence map between the two classifications, and we base it basically on Annex 1 of Eurostat's manual for air emissions accounts. So we try to stick to the methodological information from Eurostat to the best of our ability and access to the information, right? And then we need to derive direct emissions by households activities. And thanks to contributions by papers from the Castilla-La Mancha Department of Economics, we actually were able to figure this out, which is basically going to consumption surveys and trying to use their expenditure on gasoline, for example, and try to find this way, multiplying it by the ministries of the environmental ministry, the emission intensities that they provide for these fuels, to try to come up with the final kind of projected emissions from direct activities by households, right? And then just to perform a quick adjustment on the economic structure, because the city of Madrid is particularly intensive in services and has almost no production of energy and very, very little manufacturing activity. So this also introduces some modifications. And then we can, and the third challenge is to matching consumption microdata with the whole input-output system, right? As I said, we do have GDP, which is provided by the City Council, but we don't have a consumption vector as a final household final consumption expenditure vector that we require to compute the emissions by household consumption, right? So, so this is actually a challenge, and we resort to the household budget survey that is produced by the Spanish Statistical Office and is standard at the European level. And we have a long series. It's quite updated. It has a lot of disaggregation, like close to 24,000 households, from which we have a few thousands for the city of Madrid. There are two main differences in the same way that inventories and accounts had differences. We have two main differences between the information on consumption and expenditure that we find in surveys, in household surveys, and the one that we need to use as a vector at the industry level in the input-output system. One is that the information that we get from surveys is in purchases prices, or the kind of prices that households faced when they go shopping. Whereas in an input-output system, we use basic prices, which eliminates indirect taxes and redistributes the trade and transport margins from all products and concentrate them into specific industries of transport and trade. And then we have another difference, which is COICOP and other classifications, meaning that households spend on food or furniture or utilities and things like that, but we don't use this classification to organize consumption information by industries, right? So for us, these challenges, we were lucky to find this paper by Cazcarro et al. And also Mongeli et al. From 2022 and 2010, in which they detail a process through which you can come up with a consumption vector for the input-output out of service, right? For that, we need to correct the population weights because the population scope of a survey and the national accounts are relatively different, slightly. Also, we need to distribute the gap between the survey and the national accounts. And this sounds trivial, but it is not in reality, because the information from surveys is known not too much with national accounts information on consumption, which is the one we use in the input-output system. So we need to proportionally distribute or find another assumption to try to close this gap. And then, lucky enough, in Cazcarro's paper, it is provided at kind of estimated bridge matrix between COICOP, this consumption classification from surveys, and the one we use in the input-output system. And we use this to project for every year in our series using the appropriate vectors to try to update the information so that we can have at least some kind of mapping between the two. And of course, then we need to go from purchases to basic prices, which is more standard, although it's not as straightforward as it might sound. I wouldn't say especially challenging, but I made mistakes quite a few times until I realized how to compute this and to program it. It's a bit challenging, or at least was for me. And then we use the GRASS algorithm throughout to project both the CD tables and these bridge tables between the two classifications. And finally, we go from CPA to NACE, from product to industry classification, using Miller and Blair's basic supply and use framework conversions. So this methodological overview that focuses on all the challenges that we faced, I just summarized them quite quickly, but as I said, there are many steps you need to resort to methodology and to look closely to what you are doing. So we consider that from this methodological exercise, the main contribution that we can provide before going into the empirical results is actually having an air emissions account for the city of Madrid. And we hope to make it available once this paper is validated and so forth, right? So after discussing all the methodological aspects of the paper, we would like to present a few kind of like a snapshot of the key empirical results so that we can understand what do we come up with after piecing all these methodological elements together and actually finding our footprint estimation. So if we talk about GDP in the city of Madrid, talking about kilotons of CO2 equivalent, in 2010, we found that there was close to 8,000 kilotons of CO2 emitted related to the city GDP, that go down to 19,000 in 2019 and slightly down to 17,000 in 2021. And just this allows me to quickly state something, that when we presented the paper, we had a series that was going from 2013 to 2019, because this is the scope of the regional framework, the supply and use framework. But we managed to actually project with minimal assumptions the series from 2010 to 2021. So this was not actually part of the paper, but it will be if we eventually are lucky enough to publish this, to actually include it. And this also, for the presentation, I think is useful to kind of see where did we stand in 2010 and where are we arriving in 2021. Again, from the perspective of residents' consumption footprint, we got like 19,000 in 2010 and down to 13,000 in 2019 and slightly above that in 2021. And I think this is interesting because whereas for GDP we still see a decline, for household related emissions we see that we are slightly even higher than we were in 2019. From the perspective of the per capita consumption, we see a decline, perhaps not as intense as we saw from the standpoint of GDP and consumption, meaning that population is probably growing and still emissions, even if they decline. So we get these different results, right? So this from kind of like summary of the main elements, but also one of the potentialities of this exercise and embedding a city table within Figaro table is that we can actually pin down the geographical origin, and for that and for us this was very interesting to see. In 2019 we found that 20% of all the emissions from the in this case GDP carbon footprint in the city of Madrid were coming from the city, 40% from the rest of Spain, and 40%, almost 40%, from the rest of the world, including the European Union and China, Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. And also, since we have information at the consumption at the household level, we decided to perform certain disaggregations, so we could have like information about the inequality of emissions in the city, right? And just as a snapshot, we found that, for example, the bottom 20% of the equivalent income distribution pollutes 4.5 times less than the top. This a mistake, than the top 20%. So the richest 20% is emitting 4.5 times more than the bottom 20%, and I think this is remarkable. And even if we go into more detail, like the 1% of the 10%, we see a starker result. Then again, as we will see, although Jorge also helped me in understanding that this is a bit challenged now, and this is maybe too naive an approach, but still households whose main income earner or the reference person of the household is male tend to pollute substantially more than female-headed households, and we can think about that maybe, and how it correlates with income and other socio-demographic variables. And of course, largest differences from the household's perspective relate to the use of the private car and the emissions that are related to it. Again, results are plentiful, but we would like to focus on a few elements, and this is one of the results that we present in the paper, in which we detail the GDP-linked emissions from the city of Madrid, and we disaggregate these totals not only by sector but also by geographical origin, which for us was one of the main objectives. Of course, we have mining and energy supply. These in the city accounts are put together because mining activity, to my knowledge, is known as existent in the municipality, but is put together with energy production, waste management, and so on and so forth, right? And of course, this is the highest the highest ranking sector as per kilotons of CO2 equivalent, followed by transport, storage, and wholesale and retail trade. Of course, transportation, trade, and energy production emerge, as we expect, as the most polluting industries in this sense, right? But it's interesting to focus on the geographical distribution again, right? Whereas for energy supply, we know that from the city is barely producing any energy, and this is coming mostly from waste management and so forth. A lot of the scope 2, let's say, emissions coming from energy will come from the rest of Spain, and particularly also from the rest of the world, probably thinking about oil and other kind of energy products, right? But if we focus on transportation and storage, and we'll just go here to the second row, we find that more than half of the emissions are actually produced within the city, because transport activities are very important. You are moving around a lot, and this is producing a lot of emissions. So here the share of the city is way higher. So this will emerge as the first one if we only care about kind of the what is happening within the boundaries of the city. But when we include the rest of the world, we get a slightly different picture, right? Also from the rest of Spain, which is the second color, a bit lighter red, is actually important, right? And again, we have like the reverse for trade, wholesale or retail, and manufacturing, where emissions from the city are relatively low, and the rest of the world and the rest of Spain weigh considerably on the final total. Just to mention slightly that also ICT activities, because they use a lot of electricity, are energy intensive, also are very, very important. And these, together with hotels and restaurants, as we will see more from the perspective of consumption, is very important for us, because the city, the economic specialization of the city is very much focusing on the touristic services and high-end, kind of high value-added services, business services and ICT activities and so forth. And these are indirectly very, very polluting activities. They emit a lot of CO2, but this will never appear if we only care about direct incidents of these sectors. This, instead of focusing on GDP, this is focusing on consumption, as you can see, COECOP, as we discussed, which is basically the 12 main consumption groups. Of course, we can go down to even not only 3 but 3 digits, and we will have 45 different consumption purposes, but this is very difficult to convey, let alone in a presentation, right? So in this case, these main groups still allow us to have like an overview of the main segregation. And also we perform 2 additional simultaneous disaggregations, both geographical and by sector, right? So we are not only caring about emissions in the transport industry, in the transport services. Let's say you purchase a plane ticket or something like that, right? Or a train or things like that that are counted within transport consumption. But also we care about which sectors are indirectly supplying the emissions that we are recording in consumption, and where these emissions are coming from. So I don't know if more or less I'm conveying the proper idea, but we not only care about how much emissions we find in these different that are related to these consumption items, but also where is these are these emissions coming from, and also through which sectors. So we basically concentrate the economy in between sectors related to energy, and also C2H relates to manufacturing, transport, storage, and things like that, and the rest of the economy, meaning going from hotels to financial services and construction, right? And of course, we divide between Madrid, Spain, and the rest of the world, as you can see in the legend, the different colors. As a highlight, we would say that, of course, transport services that are purchased by households are the most CO2 intensive, as you can see, by a long shot. But as we can see, the emissions from all these total that are coming from Madrid and the energy sector are almost negligible. As you can see, it's the reddish, the most darker red in the first row. And of course, quite a bit is coming from other activities, and particularly from the rest of the world. Energy production from the rest of the world, which is the second lightest blue, let's say, the third from the right, is accounting from a large share of these emissions. Related to what I just mentioned before, we care about restaurants and hotels because of the specifics of the economic activity in the city, and we see that households spend quite a lot of money in restaurants and hotels within the city, and this comes on top almost the second largest CO2 intensive sector is restaurants and hotels. And this is only marginally coming from the city. As you can see, the first three kind of blocks from the left are from the city, which is quite small. But when we take into account the rest of Spain and the rest of the world and the contributions across sectors, particularly energy, of course, we see that this jumps up by a large extent, coming on top being the second largest. And for us, this is very interesting because it's even larger than food products, which also is commonly known as very CO2 intensive because of all the production process that it entails. And also kind of related to the restaurants and hotels, recreation and culture activities, services that households spend money on are also CO2 intensive, more than at least Sergio and I were expecting at the beginning. When we discussed this, kind of our expectation was challenged by these results, and hence we consider them to be kind of like an important input. Perfect. Then, kind of rounding up on this idea of household emissions, right? We not only care about the aggregate, but also the distributional contribution by different socio-demographic classifications. Of course, we can divide by income level, and we can divide by age or gender, as we do in the different columns. The first 5 columns refer to the quintiles of the income distribution. Basically, we put on a line all the population in Madrid, and we basically rank them according to their equivalized income. And we basically group them into 5 different equally sized groups. And we can see, for example, that there are certain differences in income, but differences in total CO2 within the first and the different quintiles is way larger, proportionally speaking, than in terms of emissions, right? So we see more inequality in their in emissions than in income within the city of Madrid, for example. That would be one takeaway, which is not so clear in terms of age, because as we would expect, people in their mid age from 35 to 65, 70 years old, even they are the ones that are polluting the most, but this is to be expected, since there are people that are working and using the car and transport and purchase and spend more money than the elderly, as we know. Also, we present the information disaggregated by consumption purpose, and for us this was very important because we saw the differences in the aggregate, but it's not the same as seeing the difference at the level of different socio-demographic classifications, right? And we see that, for example, transport emissions are very disproportionately concentrated in the upper quintiles, meaning that the richest 20% produces 1,600 kilograms of CO2 per year, whereas the bottom 20% only 236 kilograms, right? And this is, I think, it's interesting. And also, if another element related to what I mentioned in the previous 2 charts is that if we go to restaurants and hotels, we can see that emissions related to this sector are 10 times larger for the top 20% than the bottom 20%, meaning that as income increases, and we know this because of Engel's law, of course, the richest households are spending a disproportionate amount on restaurants and hotels and recreation activities, and these, as we saw, are quite more polluting than it looks at first glance, and we can see that it's almost 10 times higher for this specific sector. And this is going to be important for some of the simulations that we run afterwards to kind of come to grips with this idea. And I will just mention one more thing, and is that if we go to the bottom 3 rows, instead of focusing on the emissions related to household expenditure, we are doing basically the emissions resulting from direct household activities, right? Heating, cooling, also transport, and others that are mostly fugitive emissions. For transport, again, we see that the bottom 20% of households produce like 472 kilograms of CO2, but the top 20% is 2,500 kilograms, right, of CO2 related to the use of private cars, a means of transportation, motorcycles or whatever. So, and again, this is a very stark contrast. And we understand that since these direct emissions and transport emissions are very important from the perspective of expenditure and direct emissions, we are kind of coming to the realization that whatever we do in other aspects, this is quite relevant. Indeed. So this was our presentation of the carbon footprint, and kind of to overdo it a little bit, we end up doing some structural decomposition to try to understand better this thing. I think I'm running out of time, but hopefully I have still a few more minutes. And just I would say that we found this particularly interesting to try to decompose these emissions, right, into different factors. The first will be the emissions intensity, meaning how efficient is production becoming efficient in terms of CO2 emissions as technology improves. Then we have the trade structure. Are we purchasing energy products from Russia, from the United States, from other European countries because they produce it with renewable energies, and so on and so forth? And this is quite relevant, right? The trade structure and composition. And then technology, which is basically how much one sector demands from another. And if agriculture demands a lot of energy, and energy is very carbon intensive, we will end up with a very carbon intensive agriculture sector, which is to be expected. But in the case of restaurants and hotels, as we saw, it was not so clear. And then, of course, consumption demand, because ultimately this is the driver. No, this is the ultimate driver, and we need to account for that. Well, we basically expand the standard canonical decomposition into separating the trade and the technology parts of the technical coefficients matrix, using the Hadamard product, and that allow us to run certain simulations only on the trade structure and not the technology matrix, right? And to cut the long story short, we can present a few results for the city of Madrid. Then kind of the appendix of the presentation, I have it also for different countries in case you want to take a look quickly later. And we have all the different sectors for which we have disaggregation in Madrid. And right as we can see in the charts, we see this disaggregation by the different factors. And for example, if we go to let's say food and beverages, right? We see that the total emissions related to this sector are going down slightly. But if we see the different elements that is contributing to this fall in emissions, we see that intensity is improving, trade is contributing positively to emission reductions, and technology especially, meaning that there is certain redistribution of the procurement from other sectors that is contributing to emission reductions, but this is largely offset by consumption. And this is a pattern that we see repeated across countries and different sectors in the city, that technology is improving. We are decarbonizing in this sense in terms of our available technology, but consumption, as income still grows, consumption demand is offsetting most of these gains. And in some cases, as in other machinery and other sectors that we can see, is actually reversing the trend. Which is something to think about in terms of even if technology is moving fast, this is being reversed in some cases by the strength of the economy, in this sense, evoking, of course, Jevons paradox of decreasing cost of the increasing efficiency in the use of an energy source will drive prices down and correspondingly demand might go up. Um, and this is something that we are very fond of as a simulation exercise, but it might be something to discuss maybe in the questions. But just to summarize one of the simulation results that we present, we wanted to see whether changing the trade structure across the world, meaning that Madrid stops trading, let's say, with China and starts trading with the US and Germany more intensively, whether this is better or worse than acting upon consumption structure, meaning that, let's say, as we said, let's say that the rich consume as much as they do in terms of the level, but the composition is that of the median, meaning that they spend in hotels and restaurants as much as the median household does, instead of what they actually do. And we found actually that even if it was possible to reroute trade in the city or Spain from more polluting to less carbon intensive countries, we will still be better off just try to address consumption structure at the level of households. And of course, if we get into mobility choices, the results is even stronger in favor of addressing the situation of households within the city. And just as a corollary, I would say that this is also the areas on which the city council and different institutions can actually enforce policy, because it's very difficult to enforce policy on China or on Saudi Arabia or the United States, Germany, or whatever, but maybe we can do it in terms of mobility choices within the city, right? And this is it was one important takeaway. And then I'm just summarizing kind of here, right? Within these main policy implications that you can that follow up from the presentation of these results. We consider that global supply chain constraints are relevant for the decarbonization plans, as we saw, because of the geographical distribution of emissions. We see small to no upside benefits from procurement policies in terms of trade at city scale, as compared to prioritizing consumption-focused mitigation efforts related to private mobility and the impact of the household at the activity level, right? And related to this, not only private mobility choices, but targeting high emitting groups that are, of course, the richer, male-headed households and so forth, but still there are some nuance here, and maybe we can, using this data, kind of track down and pin down which groups can become better targets for emission curbing. And we provide this information, and we think it's for the first time for the city of Madrid. And we will say that this, together with the air emissions account, is the main contribution of the paper. And of course, the limitations are several, as anyone who has done this kind of work will know, in terms of the assumptions we make to come up with the table or the emissions accounts and so forth. But also the significant delay that relates to the regional input-output framework, which I understand is totally related to the workload and the complication of coming up with this data, but this imposes some constraint on our results. The regional trade structure is assumed using the national proportions and some small modifications, and this could be improved. The impact on overall emissions will be probably low relatively, probably won't modify much the ranking, indeed the level, but still, this is something we would like to work on. And finally, our dream will be to come up with uncertainty estimates, but I think this is shared overall by the literature, that it will be very important to be able to quantify the uncertainty of our estimation, but it's, I wouldn't say impossible, but at least, to the best of our abilities, right now it will be very difficult, if not impossible. But we welcome any comment or suggestions on any of these results. So thank you very much for your attention, and as I said, comments are welcome, and we are very happy and honored to be here. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jacobo. As I said in Gijón, this is an outstanding paper. Congratulations for this huge work. I think you have to think about to publish several papers from this contribution, because there are many things to publish and to explain in detail, and you can I'm sure that you can do it. Okay, so it's time open for the discussion. If any of the attendees has any problem with the English language, maybe we can switch into Spanish in any case. And here we have one question, Antonio from Seville.
Hi, Jorge. Congrats to Jacobo and Sergio because it's an impressive piece of work, especially the data compilation part. I can understand that this has been a nightmare. So congrats for surviving after that. So I would like to come a bit about the data thing, and also about how you present the results to make it more user-friendly, let's say. So on the data part, I wonder, you have mentioned several times about the tourism. So as you might recall, in the input-output table, the household consumption is only domestic household. But a lot of that tourism that you observe is external tourism that is coming into the city, on top of when you go out for tapas and so on. So I don't know if you have considered that, or if you have good data for that flows, because I mean, given that this is the second top responsible, it is relevant then that you take care of that. I mean, you don't need to give me full details. Just this is just food for thought, right? Also, another issue that you have not commented, and that this is very critical on my experience, is the imputed rents, right? When you have information from households and you try to combine the micro data and the macro data, this can have a major impact, and is something that deserves specific care. On the presentation of the results, you have shown us a chart by COICOP, but that chart also combines the CPAs. You were showing the CPAs. For me, it was not super clear if those CPAs were of the product, or that the consumer is consuming, or of the industry that is emitting, right? Maybe this is worthwhile to clarify, right? I would suggest that when you present, if you have microdata, when you present results, if you are talking about demand, you can present by COICOP. If you are talking about supply side, so the meter, the final emitter, you present by NACE. So I mean, this can make for the reader or the audience more clear, this thing that for me was not so much clear. When you present the results of the Madrid city, I mean, it is good to give a reference, right? So how is Madrid doing compared to the rest of Spain? Or, for example, compared to the Paris Agreement targets, right? So to see how bad we are, right? I think it's informative, because otherwise, if you don't have the numbers on top of your head, it's difficult to disentangle if it is something is a lot or not so much. And finally, something that has triggered a lot of questions on my mind is about the results. If they are, when you talk about, for example, rich households, poor households, or old households and young households, if the results are by person, by household, by the total household, because I mean, this can drive also many questions, right? Or many explanations. If I would recommend to present the results by equivalized size, if it is not the case, because this can also disentangle many of the questions. In this regard, you have not presented results by household types. And by household types, I mean household composition. If you are a lone person with kids, because especially in energy and so on, there is a lot of economies of scale, right? So this can drive a lot of the results. Also, I would recommend, given the massive amount of data that you have, that you try to explore that with some clustering technique or econometric technique, because some family types some of the factors are mixed. So If you are super old, probably you don't have kids with you. But if you are in the middle age, it's probably that you have kids. So if you look that from the perspective of age, there is a hidden factor behind the numbers, right? So probably considering all factors at the same time with an econometric parameterization or clustering technique can help you to really disentangle what is the most important among those factors. And once again, congrats.
You're mute, Jacobo.
Should I reply directly if there are no more questions? Well, first of all, thank you so much, because having people listening closely to what I'm saying, I mean, it's always super useful for us to have these comments, food for thought, of course, but also to make sure that we are not making gross mistakes. Many things to say here. Even if we wrote the paper, there are certain things that we tend to forget about all the individual steps. But I'm more than glad to discuss this in detail, or sending you the paper and the code and whatever else. From the many interesting points that you raised, the tourism part, yes, we take this into account. We do our best, but it's not very easy. I would be completely honest, I'm not happy with how we handled that aspect, because I didn't know exactly which database is used. Is auxiliary information is hard to come by. So at least we have it in the back of our heads, and we try to do some modifications. I don't remember off the top of my head right now what we did exactly, but we took that into account. Hopefully successfully or reasonably, but it's something particularly difficult, I think. At least it was for us when we encountered it. About the imputed data, I don't know exactly what you mean when you say that there's a problem. One problem that we encountered is that if you want to gross up micro results to national accounts, you need to be very careful to do it at 3 digits at least, and not overall, because if you do that, it's crazy. We are talking about, I don't know, for 2021, I think it's 82,000 or 82, I don't know, billion or something like that is imputed rent. So it's quite a lot. So what we do is proportionally allocating. We tried different methods, but just to be kind of cautious, we proportionally allocated at 45 COICOP groups, like 3 digits disaggregation, and we didn't compensate for the difference in imputed rents. We didn't take it into account within housing because it's fictitious in this sense. More things, COICOP and NACE supply consumption in terms of presentation, that's very useful, and something that we do is a little bit in the paper, but it's something that Sergio and I wanted to discuss soon so that we could do it for the paper, is to give reference. Like a reference framework for the amounts. As you said, the national determined contributions and other things that we can use to kind of quantify where is Madrid heading towards, or where is it at the moment. So that idea is very important for us, and we definitely want to include it or to expand on it in the paper. The household composition types, yes, and using factor decomposition. As an idea that we had, as Jorge said, trying to divide this massive work into at least 3 pieces, one for activities and overall households, another for the structural decomposition maybe, and another one going in detail into the households, and we want to compare the city, the region, and the country. Just kind of put the 3 levels together. That's the idea that we had. And in this case, it will be very useful for us to go in detail by using these or other econometric estimations that we can see, to avoid these contingency tables in which you only take into account 2 variables, but there are hidden, kind of factors, attractors, combining elements. So yeah, so we take that into account. I don't know. I think we can spend a lot of time discussing the details, but I will need to read my own code again to be very precise. But super useful comments for us. Thank you so much for listening closely and bringing to our attention these different issues. Thank you.
Amazing questions and great answers, of course. And Luis Antonio from UCLM.
Hola, pues nada, yo voy a hacer como Antonio, felicitaros. No me gustaría hacer el inmenso trabajo que habéis llevado a cabo. Y, y aún así, aunque Antonio solo me ha quitado 2 preguntas, pero aún me queda alguna. Respecto los datos que obtenéis, el transporte es muy importante, ¿no? En la huella de carbono de la ciudad de Madrid. Entonces, en relación al transporte, supongo que no podéis diferenciar, porque si no habéis mostrado los datos entre transporte aéreo y transporte terrestre. En ese sentido, lo que no me ha quedado de todo claro es si teníais el inventario de emisiones de Madrid o el inventario de emisiones de la Comunidad de Madrid. Porque, claro, ahí es muy importante, sobre todo en el transporte terrestre, diferenciar entre el residente y no residente, ¿no? Porque una persona trabaja en Móstoles que va en su coche a trabajar en Madrid, esas emisiones no son de la ciudad de Madrid? Tendrían que son emisiones de no residentes. Entonces, sí, ¿qué criterio habéis usado o cuántos habéis asignado o si tenéis inventario de Madrid de emisiones o era de la comunidad o no de la ciudad? Eso, una curiosidad que me ha surgido. Luego, la otra cuestión que podría que podría quizás cambiar un poco el enfoque es cuando tratáis a las mujeres, en el sentido de que me ha parecido entender que cuando tomamos hombres o mujeres, supongo o entiendo que debe ser el sustentador principal, si es hombre o es mujer. Y eso, claro, sesga mucho los datos de hombre y mujer porque muchas veces los sustentadores principales son viudas o son jóvenes sin hijos, sin hijos, ¿no? Entonces, aquí algunos compañeros en Albacete, en su tesis, por ejemplo, Pilar Osorio y María Ángeles, o las dos María Ángeles, su directora, ha tratado a mujer un poco distinto a la encuesta de presupuestos familiares, tratando hogares donde el porcentaje de mujeres que existe en el hogar. Entonces, no es lo mismo que haya un 20, un 50 o un 70%. Es otra forma de agrupar la información y te sale un número de hogares quizás más representativos donde las mujeres. Entonces ahí podría ser interesante. Nada, esas 2 cuestiones. Felicitaros. Bueno y profundo trabajo.
Muchas gracias por los comentarios. Empiezo por lo último. Yo creo que esa es la tentación que te da tener demasiadas variables. Que te crees que puedes reportar por género, por el sustentador principal, y eso ya me lo señaló en la presentación que hice en la SHAIO Jorge, y lo he pensado y creo que requiere mucho más trabajo hacer eso, y creo que puede ser hasta engañoso reportarlo como lo he hecho. Así como disclaimer, ¿no? En plan, creo que igual no es lo más correcto. Creo que es interesante para estimular una reflexión, pero como resultado final, si esto fuera ya un paper y enviar a una revista, si no soy capaz de hacer eso, de ir un poco más al detalle, yo, por ejemplo, lo eliminaría ahora. Entonces, me refuerzas a pensar que igual eso no está bien incluido. O sea, es mi opinión personal en este momento, ¿no? Pero me parece súper interesante. Y además creo que lo hablé también con Jorge, y la idea esta que hablé también con más gente durante las jornadas de hacer un statistical matching entre la encuesta de presupuestos familiares y la de condiciones de vida. Ese matching ya está hecho, incluso con los principios de cuentas distributivas. Lo que pasa es que eso metodológicamente es un follón, entonces, en fin, la robustez de esos datos es cuestionable muchas veces, pero esa disponibilidad de información ya la tenemos. Ahora lo que tenemos es que explotarla, y para eso a lo mejor necesitaríamos, pues eso, no sé, que los días fueran más largos o algo así, ¿no? Pero es algo que tengo en cuenta y que admito ese es un problema del artículo, y eso es empeño mío muchas veces, no de Sergio, y yo creo que ahora mismo habría que modificarlo, ¿no? Sobre lo que dices del inventario, Madrid tiene un inventario de emisiones estupendo, la ciudad. La comunidad también tiene uno y la ciudad tiene uno estupendo. Y eso es muy útil para nosotros, porque es el que utilizamos, viene hasta por tipo de gas, CO2 y el resto de gases de efecto invernadero. Entonces fue muy útil para nosotros utilizarlo, y es la base, por eso es bastante fiel, al menos en lo que es la relación con el inventario, ¿no? El tema de lo que has mencionado del transporte y el principio de residencia es que sinceramente, estoy completamente abierto a sugerencias y a correcciones porque a mí metodológicamente me suponía problemas, ¿no? Utilizábamos por ejemplo, para distribuir, para corregir por residencia, utilizaba las proporciones nacionales, utilizando, por ejemplo, el peso del aeropuerto de Barajas sobre el total de transporte aéreo de Madrid y las emisiones por transporte que reporta el ayuntamiento y demás. O sea, utilizábamos diferentes supuestos. Y tampoco sé muy bien qué alternativa, sobre todo porque la mayor parte de las sedes empresariales de España están en Madrid. Y si fuéramos puristas del principio de residencia, una enorme cantidad de las emisiones relacionadas con los beneficios contables de esas empresas habría que imputárselas a la ciudad de Madrid. Que eso sucede indirectamente también. Entonces, claro, no sé muy bien si alguien tiene sugerencias de artículos o conversaciones que podamos tener en privado, a nosotros nos ayudaría mucho para al menos tomar una decisión con consciencia más de la que tenemos ahora, que ha sido un poco intentar ser prácticos, ¿no? Y diría básicamente eso, pero que ajustamos por el principio de residencia con todo el detalle que somos capaces, con la información auxiliar del INE sobre turismo y los inventarios nacionales de Eurostat, y tenemos, bueno, simplemente decir que lo tenemos en cuenta. Pero muchas gracias por llamar la atención sobre este tema para saber qué es tan importante como nos parece o si no más.
Gracias a ti.
Muy bien, gracias. Nos hemos pasado ya de las 6 de la tarde, que suele ser una... Pero mira, Antonio tiene algo que contarnos o decir.
De nuevo, Jorge, no quiero alargarme, si solo darle 2 pinceladas a los autores si les interesa que me contacten. Tienes mi teléfono y mi correo y les doy más detalles. Uno es acerca de este matching. Nosotros en la Comisión Europea tenemos uno que es público y está muy testado, se utiliza para mucho policy análisis. Entonces, si les interesa, que me contacten y les digo cómo tienen que hacer para acceder a él, porque, bueno, como dices, es un dolor de cabeza hacerlo, no merece la pena que empezarlo de cero cuando nosotros lo tenemos y es un bien público, ¿vale? Así que, si queréis, pues contactamos, hablamos y os explico cómo acceder a él. Y comentamos otro detalle más que antes se me olvidó, que es que no tengo claro si utilicéis una tabla input-output producto por producto, sector por sector. Me ha dado la impresión de que es sector por sector. Entonces no sé si estáis teniendo en cuenta la conversión sector-producto, porque en el paper de Cascarro, todo el que has mencionado, que yo soy coautor, explicamos y medimos que no es una precisión trivial, que tiene un impacto muy grande en la reclasificación de productos. Entonces, bueno, si queréis, lo dicho con más detalle y con tranquilidad, comentamos en otro momento.
Rápidamente darte las gracias y bueno, y desearte suerte porque te tomamos la palabra. Eso no lo dudes porque no vamos a perder esa oportunidad. Gracias. Y sobre lo último que has dicho, sí, lo tenemos en cuenta. La conversión producto-industria lo tenemos en cuenta. Además, siempre medimos que la suma total nos dé la misma para saber que la redistribución no está alterando los totales, que es algo que sucede cuando no tienes cuidado. Y sí, en todo momento utilizamos los dos, porque como partimos del marco uso y destino, origen y destino, eso nos permite hacer las diferentes conversiones y siempre hacemos cada uno de los pasos, pues eso, empezando por producto y acabando por industria. Los resultados siempre los presento por industria porque me parece más intuitivo simplemente o por costumbre personal. Pero eso está siempre convertido, o sea, la matriz de puente que sacamos del artículo, que maravilloso, y dar las gracias por la generosidad de tener un apéndice online, porque eso a cualquier investigador le da la vida, ¿no? Y lo tenemos en cuenta y creo que seguimos las cosas con bastante atención, pero vamos, no está exento de aprender o ser todavía más riguroso, así que gracias por recalcarlo.
Muy bien, gracias. ¿Algún comentario más? No, bueno, pues bueno, decíamos antes que teníamos un anuncio que dar. Primero de todo, agradeceros el gran trabajo que habéis hecho, haber asistido a SHAIO, haberlo presentado, haberos postulado para el premio. Yo creo que ha sido totalmente merecido viendo la cantidad de trabajo que habéis hecho y la calidad del mismo y sobre todo la utilidad que tiene. Así que será un gusto poder leer los papers que de aquí emanen. Ojalá sean muchos y fructíferos, pero bueno, también será un gusto saber que en el futuro pues la Comunidad de Madrid, el Ayuntamiento de Madrid, pues hacen uso de esta información que yo creo que es totalmente útil para todos. Así que mil gracias a los dos, especialmente a ti, Jacobo, evidentemente, porque has estado aquí sin callarte 40 minutos, exactamente además, te has ceñido al tiempo, así que gracias, pero también, por supuesto, a Sergio, que también es el culpable de todo esto. Así que genial. Y nada, para terminar el webinar, pues decir que el Council de la SHAIO quiere informar a la comunidad de algo muy importante, ¿no? Y es que tenemos la noticia, podemos confirmar la noticia de que el próximo workshop permanente de la SHAIO va a tener lugar en Palma de Mallorca al principio de septiembre de 2025 y que será la Universidad de Baleares, también junto al Instituto de Estadística de Baleares, IBESTAT, quienes lleven a cabo esta organización. En las próximas semanas tendréis información vía email o a través de nuestras páginas web o nuestras redes sociales acerca de más detalles sobre el Congreso, las fechas específicas y demás, y toda la información relevante que conlleva un evento de este tipo. Y nada, desde la Junta de la SHAIO queremos agradecer principalmente a Elizabeth Valle y Patricia Tous, una de la Universidad de Baleares y otra de IBESTAT, y por supuesto a sus equipos, pues haber accedido a acogernos el año que viene en su fantástica isla. Y nada más, podemos acabar aquí la sesión y este webinar. Agradecer a todos los participantes existentes y una vez más a Jacobo y Sergio por vuestro gran trabajo. Así que un placer y nos vemos pronto.
Muchas gracias. Hasta
Bien,
luego.
hasta luego.